where when a disaster occurs, you have to essentially build a complete supply chain in about 24 to 36 hours that gets supplies quickly as a matter of life and death. So the speed, the urgency are all very, very big differences.
Welcome to the Tippie Leads podcast. Stories from the University of Iowa's Tippie College of Business that will change the way you work and lead. Produced by the Tippie Leadership Collaborative. I'm your host, Nick Westergaard. I teach at Tippie and lead our Story Lab program. This podcast provides another opportunity to share stories from Tippie with our community and beyond. Each season of Tippie Leads, we focus on a grand challenge in today's changing world of work. This season, we're looking at risk. As we've heard, natural disasters pose risks far beyond individual businesses, impacting the entire insurance industry and disrupting supply chains that deliver critical relief. How can we ensure essential supplies reach victims quickly? And how can both for-profit companies like Walmart stocking up on generators and relief organizations like the Red Cross respond effectively? In this episode, Tippie Professor Ann Campbell will help us explore these questions. Logistics aren't just for disaster response. They shape our daily lives too. From managing supply chains to planning trips, navigating challenges is key. MBA student Laura Goddard shares the risks of traveling with motion sickness and the extra planning it takes. And finally, we'll bring it all together with a final tip E just for you. Ready? Let's get started. Ann Melissa Campbell is the Clement T. and Sylvia H. Hansen Family Chair in Manufacturing Productivity in the Department of Business Analytics at the Tippie College of Business. Her research focuses on freight transportation, especially on problems related to new and emerging business models, as well as the logistics of disaster preparation and relief. She is a recipient of the NSF Career Award and serves as an area editor for Transportation Science. As chair, she led the department's efforts to win the 2021 Informs UPS George D. Smith Prize for Excellence in Analytics Education. Ann Campbell, looking forward to chatting with you. And I realize looking forward seems like an awkward thing to say to someone when you're going to talk about disaster logistics. So I don't know if anyone else has tripped over the introduction in talking to you quite like that.
No, I actually think looking forward is sort of the key to success when it comes to disaster logistics. Because if you are completely unprepared, that tends to translate to poorer outcomes. So I'm going to say it's a positive thing.
Okay, good save. Good save. I feel better already. So I do have to ask, with your focus, which we've heard about in your bio, how did you get into this area of study and expertise? What drew you to disaster?
Well, I'm going to have to say it is the news, and I'm going to date myself. It was the tsunami in Indonesia. So I have had a career of studying freight logistics, which is how you transport products from plants to warehouses, warehouses to stores, stores to customers, things like that. And the news after the tsunami in Indonesia was really, why is it taking so long for supplies to get to people? And I'm sure that had happened before, but just at that point in time, given where I was in my career, it just became something I became very curious about, is why it was taking so long to get supplies to people. And so I started reading about it and thinking about it. And I'm always driven in my research by questions. And my question I started thinking about was, how are the problems in a disaster scenario different than in a regular business supply chain scenario? What are the objectives different? Are the methods different? And so that was this perspective I started thinking about. And so the tsunami was the inspiration, but I started trying to think about it in a more general sense.
Well, and I think, some of the best research always has those jaw-dropping moments that really both surprise you, and sometimes it can be that something was sitting there in plain sight. And with your work, what you just said, talking about, the framing there, and your kind of definitions of commercial supply chain versus humanitarian supply chain, and differences. And I wondered if you'd kind of give some quick definitions there.
In terms of what some of the differences are?
Yeah, yeah.
Sure. Well, so a couple of different things come into play, but the biggest difference in definition of the supply chain design is for a commercial supply chain, it's something they can evolve to over years. And over time, they're constantly tweaking it, but they can choose a location for the warehouse where the cost per acre is reasonable, and they can think about labor costs, and they can make all of these deliberate, careful choices over time. Where when a disaster occurs, you have to essentially build a complete supply chain in about 24 to 36 hours that gets supplies, trucks, vans, and the right products to people quickly as a matter of life and death. So the speed, the urgency are all very, very big differences. And so where I started was the very basic question, because I come from, my research is primarily in looking at deliveries. Is I started thinking about, just if you're thinking about sequencing a set of deliveries to a variety of different communities, to deliver food, medicine, aid, how is that different in a disaster context than in a business context? Because in a business context, it's always driven by cost. So you want to drive as few miles as possible, which uses the least fuel and the least amount of driver time. And that was the fundamental, most simplest question I started with. And I realized if you always make decisions out of a cost basis in a disaster situation, it is not remotely fair. And so the fairness thing is the other thing that comes up as a big difference between commercial and disaster supply chains, is you have to think about, if I always make the furthest city or the furthest set of people last, then I'm not being very fair, because I'm not serving their needs as well as other people's needs. So I would say that the time that you have to develop the supply chain and thinking about the fairness of service to those affected are fundamental differences that are important to consider and research in this area.
Well, and you talk about the different variables as well. And what I mentioned earlier before we got on, that I have a lot of your work out in front of me, and it's even filled my desk. And I have I've employed one of my kids' music stands from band over here. But and why so much is because there's a lot of different levels to the challenges. I mean, you talk about, delivery, but you've looked at fuel, you've looked at routes, you've looked at where supplies are positioned, and staging areas for the fuel. So it almost seems like, as you've been looking at this, I would assume that one of these has led you to the next one. Like after it was fuel, it was like, well, what about where the fuel is? So how did that all unravel or unfold?
Sure. So the other early significant disaster that had a big impact on my thinking was Hurricane Katrina. So I'm dating myself again that way. But what Hurricane Katrina had was the unprecedented size in terms of the number of people impacted, was bigger than any prior event in the United States in recent memory. And as the recovery from Hurricane Katrina got to a fairly mature point, I was able to interview some people who were involved with rescue efforts and helping people. And I interviewed someone who worked at the Red Cross. And I said, how did the scale of Hurricane Katrina change how you think about things? And she said, we realize that there's only a limited number of things you can get in a short amount of time. And the example she used was cots and debit cards. She said cots are made in China. So if I suddenly need 50,000 cots, I cannot just load up my van and go to a few Walmarts and get 50,000 cots, right?
Right. Yeah.
And so they realize the things that are hard to get and the volume needed for an event like that all are things that you need to store in advance. And then the same thing she was saying with debit cards is they would give people debit cards to purchase their toiletries, for example, go buy toothpaste and things like that. But the same thing as the debit cards are made internationally, the blanks. And so you can't just come up with 100,000 blanks. And so even though that's something you think of, oh, the things I should store are MREs and certain things like that. But this redefined what should be the kinds of things you store. It is those things you can't get quickly. And so that's what sort of led to the paper about the pre-positioning. It was recognizing there are certain things that you really need to have on the ready because, for example, in the United States, you know that there is going to be hurricanes in the south and southeast. You may not know exactly where. And so that led to sort of that paper discussing having multiple pre-positioning locations for these kind of unusual things that you cannot replace frequently or quickly when a disaster occurs, and thinking about where those should be. So that's what led to that paper. And then as I worked more with the Red Cross, they talked about when they know a disaster event's going to happen in, say, mid-Florida, then they can have semi-trucks ready in Atlanta filled with food, bedding, whatever kind of supplies. They can have the semi-trucks loaded up and ready in the Atlanta area, ready to go for as soon as the hurricane clears the area. So maybe they'll have some things pre-stored in Florida, these kinds of things that I talked about, and then the things that you want fresh or that you can get quickly, they can roll in from Atlanta. And so as that was going on, we had a series of multiple events hit Haiti and hit Puerto Rico. And so then the questions that kept me up at night then is you can't have a semi-truck waiting to roll into Puerto Rico and Haiti. They are in a different situation from being on an island. And an island, everything either has to be flown in or coming on ship. And then if it's coming by ship, you could have had some damage to your port. And so they really have to think about disasters in a different way. And so with a student, we started looking at what are some of the things you run out of first or most critical on an island. And to our kind of surprise, but it seemed to pop up everywhere, it was fuel. Because fuel is used not just to run the vehicles that deliver things and rescue people, but one of the things that goes down first in an island is the power grid. And so people are running generators in hospitals, for example, with fuel. And so fuel became critical. And so we started thinking about the question of pre-positioning fuel on islands is because they don't have that power to have vehicles come in. But also on an island, you have a lot of places on an island that are vulnerable. And so that's when we had to start looking at when you're choosing where to store things on an island, you have to think about historically, where does the hurricane hit? Does it hit from the south? Does it hit from the north? Because you don't want to put this most valuable thing you need in a place of great risk.
Yeah.
So when you think about pre-positioning, you have to not only think about what, but you have to think about risk as well. And so these questions are, I think, kind of interesting and different in some ways than commercial supply chains. So sorry I get excited. These things are interesting to me.
No, you went exactly where I was thinking of with the fuel on the island, and it made me think as I was reading too back to things that you talked about the inspiration coming from the news, and on the Puerto Rico side of things, it talked about the stories that supplies were sitting there because of the fuel problem and couldn't get to people. So I think that it's really different when you think about the geography. And you mentioned New Orleans, but then you also looked at you talk about some of these, we know disaster is going to hit, and then we have Sandy a few years back in New York. And what I guess I was going to say, I was going to contrast that to Puerto Rico, but Manhattan also being an island as well, but I guess a different kind of island in terms
With
of,
some bridges.
yeah, yeah. So what were the challenges posed there?
I don't know a lot of details about Sandy, but obviously Puerto Rico is much further from another land destination in terms of boats being able to get there, or ships getting there quickly. So one of the articles we worked on was joint with working with FEMA, and this idea that FEMA was looking at of having fuel travel on FEMA-based ships to be able to do fuel replenishment um, via ships coming to the ports on an island. I would think Manhattan would be close enough that unless all the access points to the island have been destroyed, which I don't believe that they were, something like that wouldn't be as needed. The more isolated the island is, obviously the preparation and the independence is more critical.
You mentioned FEMA, and what I also found fascinating about your work is talking about impact and outcomes for organizations, both nonprofit and for profit. I wondered if you'd say a bit more about what an organization of either kind can do differently as a result, based on knowing what more about what we now know.
Well, I would say the lesson I have learned from many people that I have interviewed, and that's what I've tried to learn a lot from, is talking to people who have the firsthand advice through going through all kinds of things, is a partial plan or a bad plan is better than no plan. Is the lesson I have learned, that if you wait for a disaster to happen and then start trying to plan, it becomes virtually impossible. You can't reach anyone that you would like to. Often cell phones are down, communication is down. But if you have a basic plan of, we will get this supply from this location because we have it pre-stored, this group is in charge of these efforts. If you have just some sort of basic plan in place, even if you don't know the extent of what the damage or the particular type of disaster, any kind of plan is better than no plan, is just the lesson I've heard over and over again, because of communication issues and the time it often takes to figure things out.
Managing risk in business is one thing, but it also pops up in everyday life, sometimes in ways that are stressful in the moment, but easier to laugh about later. MBA student Laura Goddard knows this firsthand. She shared a story about the challenges of traveling with motion sickness and the planning and improvising it requires at our Fall 2023 Story Lab Showcase.
As I shuffled out of the bathroom stall, I could feel the other women's eyes following me. I was in the Munich airport on my way to visit my brother in Berlin, and motion sickness had driven me to spend a hazy, indeterminate amount of time in front of the toilet. And what I didn't realize was that while I was there, I'd been hallucinating and talking to myself, which explained the odd looks. But I was just grateful to finally be sort of upright, so I washed my hands and I returned to the gate area, grateful to lie down on the cool tile. It didn't strike me for quite some time that it was odd, the peace and quiet I was grateful for, that there should have been more people there. And finally I went to investigate, and I realized while I was out of it, my flight had been moved to another gate and moved on without me, so I was stuck in quite the pickle. I made my way to the gate agent and I asked, "Entschuldigen Sie, sprechen Sie Englisch? Das wäre viel leichter, wenn ich auf Englisch sprechen könnte." Which means, "Excuse me, do you speak English? This will be a lot easier if I can speak in English." And luckily, not only did they speak English, but these were some of the nicest gate agents I've ever encountered, because the next thing I discovered was that in trying to reach my brother, I actually had left my address book. Yes, an address book. It was pre-2007. I'd left it in my checked luggage, so I didn't know his phone number. So these gate agents looked him up, called him, he actually answered, and between them they worked it out. I got on a different flight, and it all was okay. I wish I could tell you that this was the only time motion sickness has been so disruptive in my life, but alas, that is not the case. I have been motion sick my entire life on anything that moves. Cars, mountain gondolas, paragliding. I get sick at movies and TV. One time, I took an elevator up to the top floor of a Toronto Sheraton hotel, and the ride made me so ill, I chose to walk back down all 43 flights, 602 stairs. So if an elevator ride does that to me, you can imagine what a trip to Colorado would do. It was 2016, and I had entered our band Slewgrass in the Telluride Bluegrass Festival Band Contest. My husband and I were in the band together, so we needed to bring our 5-year-old along. And because we brought the 5-year-old along, then we also needed to bring Grandma along. So it was a whole family affair. The night before the contest, we were on the other side of the mountains from Telluride in this beautiful little town called Ouray. And our hotel was right on the river, which was cool and cold and rushing. And right on the other side were these steep mountains. And the hotel was a series of cabins, and they also had this hot tub outside. So we could sit outside in the hot tub in the cold air, look at the stars. It was really magical. But the next morning started pretty early, and that was the first mistake. The second one was drinking coffee on an empty stomach. Yeah, then there were nerves about the upcoming contest, and by the time we were winding our way up those mountain roads, I knew I was in trouble. As I knelt in the gravel next to the car, I could hear my bandmates whispering about me. "Do you think she'll be okay? Can we still play?" I got back into the van, and we made our way to Telluride, where the first thing I did was find a bathroom. And eventually I could move out of the bathroom into the audience area for where the band contest was going to be held. And I sat there in a camp chair, head down in my hands. And finally I was able to unpack my viola, and we stood in an alleyway in a circle, running through the songs we were going to play. And our mandolin player looked at me and said, "You're a trooper, Laura." We did play the contest. I don't know where we placed. They only ranked the top 3 bands, so we were somewhere between 4 and 12. But the thing I was proudest of was actually just making it onto that stage. Because Telluride was just one in a series of incidents that changed how I see my motion sickness. For a long time, for my whole life, I'd seen it as a handicap. And sure, it kept me from doing things that I thought I'd enjoy and that other people enjoy or seem to. Amusement parks, sailing, IMAX theaters. But I've come to see my motion sickness as a strength. Because when you have dragged yourself alone and nauseated through multiple security checkpoints in a foreign language, you feel like you can do pretty much anything. We know life is an adventure, right? I'm going to get sick getting there, but I'm going to live it anyway. Thank you.
That was Laura Goddard live at our Fall 2023 Story Lab Showcase in downtown Iowa City. You can watch the video of Laura's story and other Tippie storytellers via the link in this week's show notes. Before we wrap up, let's go back to Ann Campbell one last time for a final tip E for you to remember in your work.
Whenever there is a disaster, the value of donating money versus sending actual supplies, unless it is in your community, is so valuable, because those who are local can purchase the things that are actually needed at that time at a better price and can get it logistically smoother, cheaper than if we order it here and ship it. So I guess one of the lessons I would take away for myself is I always donate money to a disaster rather than my assorted products that I do not need, unless it happens to be in my community where people are directly using it.
Not all risks come from physical storms. Some are shaped by shifting political and economic winds. With election season just behind us, it's worth considering how individuals and organizations navigate these uncertainties. Beyond voting, how can we anticipate and prepare for political change? Tippie marketing professor Tom Gruca has studied this through the Iowa electronic markets, offering a surprisingly accurate way to predict election outcomes. In our next episode, we'll explore how political betting markets have reshaped polling and how they can help individuals and businesses manage the risks of an uncertain political landscape. This episode of Tippie Leads was written and produced by me, Nick Westergaard, and Steve Courtwright. Special thanks to Ann Campbell and Laura Goddard for taking the risk of sharing their stories. Tippie Leads is a production of the Tippie Leadership Collaborative. To learn more, go to tippie.uiowa.edu/Tippie Leads. If you like this episode, share it with a friend or coworker, or better yet, subscribe to the show on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, or wherever you like to listen. And if you're feeling generous, consider leaving us a rating or review to help others find the show. This is Nick Westergaard signing off. On behalf of everyone at Tippie, thanks for listening, and go Hawks!